All right, and good morning, everybody. And let me just make sure my audio is coming through properly. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, thank you very much. So we'll go ahead and get started this morning. Welcome to the Alaska Land Mobile Radio Quarterly Live Training. This is radio programming best practices. And I know, as has been mentioned, we will be recording this meeting. It will be posted to the ALMR website here for folks that could not join us live. As a reminder, please feel free to ask questions as we go through the presentation. You can use the raise your hand button in Microsoft Teams, or feel free to put a note in chat, or just speak up, and I'll try and hear you, and keep an eye on all of those sources. So do whatever makes you feel comfortable as we go through some of these things. So up on your screen, for those of us that are joining on Teams, there are a few objectives here for this training. I want to introduce some of our ALMR staff that are on the call with me. My name is Dan Nelson. I've got also on the call Sherry and Nick who will be helping us answer questions and go through some things here. So our objectives of this really were to bring forth a lot of the information, a lot of the common questions that we see at the ALMR help desk and issues that come up, and try and put it into one place for folks. So as you are doing radio programming and updates, you can watch out for some of these things. There's a couple pitfalls and issues that we see here, and also just some good ideas that we want to share with you from the perspective of the help desk that may help you and your agency in your operations and in your troubleshooting. We certainly know that each agency operates differently, so certainly take these things as good best practices, but they may not always be applicable to everybody. And certainly feel free to ask questions if you have something specific on some of these, or follow up with either myself or the help desk later, and we'd be happy to help with that. On this training, we are going to be using the visuals from the Motorola CPS software using an APX radio. So we certainly realize not everybody on the system uses APX radios in this software, but this is a good sample for you, and hopefully some of the terminology will be consistent. If you are using different radios, you may have some different terminology, so verify that with your radio manufacturer. So with that, are there any questions before we get started? And if not, we'll go forward here. So when you're doing the radio programming, kind of one of the more basic functions that we deal with, and most everybody here is familiar with adding radios and making changes to radios, and the help desk will issue you a radio ID, and you will assign an alias to those radios. So just for terminology's sake, the radio ID is that numeric identifier. Every agency in the system has a unique range of radio IDs that are assigned to them. The alias is set by the agency, but always has a prefix. So for example, let's say the ALMR prefix is AML. Every one of your aliases will start with that prefix for your agency. Critical because this is a shared system.
Press 1 to listen to the recording. Press 2 to save the recording. Press 3 to re-record your message.
All right, apologies for that. So because this is a shared system, that unique prefix identifier is essential to help us try and find...
Message saved. Goodbye.
Try and find the appropriate radio in the system. So a couple things there that we've been seeing very consistently is when you have those radio IDs, and especially in some parts of the system where some software, and this APX software is a great example of that. Those radio IDs are very, very easy to duplicate in the system. So if you use the clone radio function especially, and this is coming from experience, I personally did this to a fire department where I made every one of their radios the same radio ID because I didn't realize that clone function was picking up the template that I was using. So what ends up happening is when that same radio ID comes in the system essentially gets very, very confused, especially when you're dealing with radios that are on multiple sites. So essentially you can see one of those radios might key up, the system goes to that radio, then another radio might key up, the system goes, well, the radio is over in this other site now, so it shuts off the radios on the other side. It really creates some very, very unpredictable behavior. So one of the big things for a takeaway, just kind of on their basics, is make sure that the radio ID is correct for the radio that you are using. Again, you can get that list from the help desk at any time. Very recently, those were sent out at the end of last year in order to verify that. So please feel free that please make sure that you have the correct list, the most recent list, and feel free to contact the help desk if you have any questions with that. So the first key thing is to make sure that your radio ID is correct and that you're not duplicating those radio IDs. The alias, as I started to mention, has a unique prefix for your agency. However, you can set that alias to whatever works for you as far as your agency. So whatever your naming convention is, that's up to you, up to a maximum of 12 characters, including that usually 3-character prefix. So what's important to recognize about the alias is that those aliases will come up on the dispatch console. So that's where your dispatchers will be able to see that particular alias for when that radio keys up. And that becomes especially important when we're dealing with things like emergency alarms that we'll talk about. You can also program the alias in your code plug, which we'll look at in just a second. Be careful that when you change that alias in your code plug, so if you put in something different than what the system has, be aware that that is not going to change what the console sees. It is only based on what is loaded in the system itself. So if you put something else in there, that doesn't change the alias in the system. If you need to change it, again, contact the help desk and they'll be happy to update that so the dispatchers can see that. So in the Motorola APX world, there are, in that CPS, there's 3 different areas that have the radio ID and alias that I just want to point out to folks here real quick. So the first one is in the trunking system configuration. And you'll notice down here, there's a slot for unit ID. That's where that ID number will go in. And I want to point out on this visual that you might see the unit ID number is grayed out. So when fields in the CPS are grayed out, typically the first thing you want to check is make sure that you have your system key loaded. Generally, most things that have to do with trunking will be grayed out unless you have the system key loaded. So just be aware of that. That's usually the first thing to check, and usually the first thing I personally forget. So make sure in trunking system configuration you have the unit ID. And then the second place for that unit ID is in the OTAR, the over-the-air rekeying configuration. Not everybody uses this, so you may not have it enabled. So this particular radio does not have it enabled, but if you see up there, there's a prompt for the OTAR radio ID, which has got a 1 and is grayed out. That's where you'd put that radio ID. So you're going to put that in 2 different places. And then finally, your alias. Once again, it's good best practice to match the alias that you have registered with the ALMR system into your code plug. So that's under radio wide, under the user information and password section, you can see the radio alias field. And again, feel free to raise your hand or type in chat as we have questions, and I'll pause as we go through. So along that same vein, in the clone radio tool, this is the one in the APX software that I was pointing out is very, very easy to duplicate. Whatever code plug you happen to have open will have that particular radio ID pre-filled in. It's not blank, it won't prompt you. So as you go and use the clone tool to clone radios, that's where it's very, very easy to duplicate those radio IDs. So what you see here on the screen is the clone window. When that comes up, you'll see the radio ID is down here in the trunking section. And then you also have a space here for the radio alias. Again, make sure all 3 of those sections, those 2 radio IDs, as well as the radio alias are correct. So that's radio ID and alias. Before I move on to our next subject, are there any questions or comments on that? All right. We go forward to our next section here, and definitely want to also invite our other ALMR staff members. If you have anything to add, please feel free to do so. So one of the things that we get a lot of issues for when we get issues where radios aren't working the way they expect is sometimes there's some configuration issues in the code plug that aren't correct. So one of the big ones that I want to talk about here is preferred sites. So preferred sites is a option in the trunking personality here in an APX radio and the Motorola radios as well as others, which basically indicates certain towers or certain RF sites that either the radio will prefer or least prefer. And you can see an example here from one code plug that I've got up on the screen. You can see down there there's 3 preferred sites and 3 least preferred sites. For most of our users, I will say the 99% of our users, preferred sites is not something that anybody needs to configure or should configure. It really can make the behavior of the radio and the system very unpredictable. We are still finding that in various code plugs that we come across where some sites, even maybe sites that aren't active anymore, are being showed as preferred sites. So generally, we recommend do not have any preferred sites in your code plug. If they're not a preferred site, you're going to see it like this, is what this will look like, at least in the APX software. Please check all of your trunking personalities in your code plug and make sure that there are not any preferred sites defined. Again, you're going to see this kind of placeholder line. That's always there, but anything else should not be in there. If you think you have a use case for preferred site, please reach out to us and talk about it. And most folks don't, but there may be just a few cases here where it might make good sense. But in general, preferred sites will cause more trouble than they may help, at least from the experience we've had here. So going off of preferred sites, I want to talk a little bit about the emergency button, or what we might refer to as the man down alarm. Some of the radios may have a different terminology for it. In the Motorola's, it's very common to see the orange button. This often refers to, if somebody has some sort of emergency, they can't key up, they can't transmit. The idea is to hit that alarm and your dispatch centers will be notified. It's very, very useful in the trunking systems to be able to use that feature because obviously, as we talked about the radio alias, the radio ID will show up for the dispatch center and the dispatchers can take appropriate action. There's a couple administrative requirements for using the E button, and I want to point out that there is a procedure on this. If your agency uses that, please see the ALMR procedure, which is 300-7, for specific information on the emergency button. But what I would really want to reiterate is if you have this feature programmed in your radios and you are not running your own dispatch center, so if you're a member of a regional dispatch center, it is required that you have a written agreement with another agency dispatch center if they are going to get these E-button activations for you. So that procedure outlines this a little bit, but you want to make sure that they have your radio aliases, your radio IDs, the contact information for your folks, cell phones and some of those things, and the procedures that those E-buttons are to follow. So do not program these and then just have it show up, obviously, your dispatch center. You want to have that agreement written out. I really encourage folks to look and see if an emergency button is necessary, and that really is going to depend on each agency's operations. Some agencies program it, some agencies don't. Obviously, very common, and for our law enforcement agencies, some fire departments program it, some fire departments don't. So basically, the easiest way to program that functionality is to decide what that button is to be used for. So in the APX configuration, if you go into radio ergonomics configuration, then go down to controls, and then go down to buttons, you're going to see a screen very similar to this. It may vary based on the type of radio. If you see on that first line that talks about the top button, in the right-hand column, if you're on a trunking talk group, it has one function. If you're on a conventional talk group, it has another. Those can be identical if they apply. So if you see here, the top button under trunking feature is set to emergency. That is your emergency button. So you can certainly change that button to another programming or just put it unprogrammed, what your preference is if you don't want to use it. If you do want to use that feature, keep that programmed at emergency. I want to point out something that's a little bit confusing on the APX software is there's also another section right next to those buttons called accessory. And so these accessory buttons might apply to a remote speaker mic or some other type of accessory that you may have for your radio. If you'll notice, if you can see on the writing, the name of the first button up there on the accessory is accessory orange. So don't get confused by programming the accessory button as your main button. It gets real confusing. So the button that's built in is the top button on this slide. The accessory button orange is for, like I say, for remote speaker mic or something similar. You obviously can program that as an emergency button. Some folks do, but just be sure that you're programming the button that you intend to program. It just gets a little bit confusing. When you're dealing with emergency configuration, there's a couple additional things in the code plug that you need to do and make sure you have correct. So this is a shot from a trunking personality, and the trunking personality is going to ask you trunking emergency profile selection, and there's a drop-down menu. That leads you to another section of the code plug that has to be defined before you define that emergency button. So if you go back to the tree in the APX software, you're going to see a header that says emergency configuration and then trunking emergency profile. And on this screen, you're going to see a couple different options that are available to you for setting up one of these emergency profiles. And there's a couple things to be aware of for you to look at. The big one, what the emergency operation is. So in this instance, we have it as an alarm and call, which is fairly standard. But you're going to see in a section called auto transmit. Right now, this example has emergency auto transmit mode disabled. What emergency auto transmit is that will key up the mic when you press down on that emergency button. If you were to enable that, you get the option on there to for a period of time. So for instance, we could make that enabled. You could have the mic transmit for 10 seconds automatically from this configuration. And you can have different trunking emergency profiles, just like you have different personalities to do different things on different talk groups. So there's a couple different options for you. Again, I would work with, depending on the talk group that you're using. If it's a shared talk group, obviously this has to be dealt with the agencies that share it, as well as the dispatch center of, is that going to be a good idea? Is that something that you want to put in there? Do you have the proper SOPs to do that? And those types of questions. So just make sure that when you are using the emergency button or the man down, that you have those procedures in place, that you have those SOPs in place, and that your users are trained up on exactly what that button does. I'm sure if you ask any dispatcher, it is by design a very disruptive thing on the console, and certainly does take some work to resolve those things. So we want to make sure that is being done in advance and is being done per our procedures. So all of our procedures are located on the ALMR website, and at the end of the training, I'll point out where those are if you have not used those before. I'm going to take just a brief pause here to see if there are any questions before I go on to the next topic. So switching gears a little bit from the emergency button, which some people may or may not use, everybody should have the interoperable emergency zones programmed in their radios. And you may recall that about a year to 14 months ago, there was a revamp done of the interop zones. So those of you that are familiar with the zones that were geographically aligned with the old state trooper detachments, so that would be A-HAIL, AIC2, B-HAIL, C-HAIL, etc. Those zones no longer exist and have been converted into 3 regional talk groups, which is the North Zone, North interop zone, central interop zone, and southeast interop zone. So this card shows one of those zones, what the conversion looks like. If you have not programmed in these interoperable zones in the new method, so it's going to show the call and the command one. There's 6 or 7 of these that are trunked talk groups, and then the other half of that zone is some conventional simplex options. If you do not have your radios programmed into this new format, please do so immediately. The old interop zones do not function anymore. So if you do have an emergency or somewhere where you have to go into an interop with somebody that you don't have a mutual aid agreement with or don't have a talk group sharing agreement with, you must have these in there for those interops to work properly. Basically, they went into those 3 interop zones, as I mentioned, that have both trunking and conventional. If anybody has questions on this, I do have some guidance and some documentation that went out originally when this change was made with the dispatch centers. It's also listed in our procedure 300-3. You are required to have, by your membership agreement, the zone programmed in which you physically operate. However, we do recommend, if you do have the radio capacity to do so, make sure all 3 of those zones are programmed into each of your units. And we do have some of the code plugs and things here we can send you as well. If you don't have the code plug for the lineup, again, just let me know or let the help desk know. We'll be happy to get that to you, and you can drag and drop that into your radios. So when we talk about scanning, there's a lot of misconception about scanning as it relates to trunked radio systems. And there's a couple different methods of scanning that you might see if you've been into the code plug and try to do some of the scan configuration. A couple things I want to talk about scanning before we get too much further into this conversation. Conventional scanning that many of us may be aware of or have used in the past was really a relatively simple affair. You set up scan, your radio basically very quickly scanned through those conventional frequencies to see if anybody was talking. If there was traffic on there, it stopped and it let you listen until that traffic was done. That worked well in the conventional world. So when we have conventional frequencies, those are basically transmitting out in the clear anytime they're being used. So no matter if you had 1 antenna, 10 sites that were simulcasting, whatever it was fairly easy for the radio to be able to pick those up. In a P25 system like ALMR, and I'm going to, for the purpose of what I'm about to say, this doesn't necessarily apply to Zone 4, which is in the municipality of Anchorage. The radio in the system doesn't transmit any traffic unless a radio is actually requesting it. So, for instance, if you are in Fairbanks and I've got my radio and I'm listening to the ALMR talk group for the technicians, and the site that I'm affiliated with up in Fairbanks will give me that traffic. If I turn my radio off and nobody else is tuned to that talk group, that traffic doesn't broadcast any longer because there's not actually a radio requesting it from the site that I'm on. So because of that limitation, when we deal with scanning of talk groups, unless there is someone on that particular talk or on that particular site also affiliated with that talk group, your scanning won't necessarily work as you expect. P25 trunking scanning like this we're not set up where it's basically broadcasts everything. So that's the first thing that's important to understand when you're doing scanning configuration. There's a couple different types of scanning, which I'll talk to in just a second, but there is a possibility to also set up scanning to go between a P25 talk group in ALMR and going into a conventional. So a good use case for this, let's say you have a dispatch channel that is ALMR and you have a tactical channel that's your fire ground. It's certainly possible for one radio to scan between both of those, but there's not really any priority put into either of those. So it's also very likely when you set scanning up like that you might miss traffic if it's busy. So some things just to be aware of. When you look in the code plug, there's 3 options, and actually if you're on an APX, there's now 4 options, but these are 3 of the main ones. So a conventional scan allows you to scan conventional channels only. Again, that works just fine. Priority scan is only for P25 talk groups, only for ALMR talk groups, and then that multi-system will scan between both. Generally, we just simply do not recommend that you enable any scan capabilities in your code plug for some of the reasons that I just said, especially with users that may not be familiar with it or are expecting it to work in the way that scanning previously did with conventional. So it's just not something we recommend doing. And we can certainly talk more one-on-one with any particular use case that you might have. But what I would highly recommend you do is disable scan. You can do that by going into the trunking configuration and then going to each trunking personality. And there's a section there for your scan list selection. You can just select that to none. That will ensure that you don't have anything in there that's basically a non-priority scan or doing something that you don't expect. And then I've got just a few other best practices that I want to share with you, kind of miscellaneous things, before I open up for questions and discussion. Some radios, so the APX Portable is a good example of this, where you have one channel, but the top display says one thing and your main display says another. And this is another one that's got me, especially when I converted from old XTL code plugs to APX. There's two different fields when you go into zone channel assignment. One is channel name, which is what displays on your main display, and the other is the top display channel. And the top display channel, I believe the difference is has less characters. So in this, you'll notice that channel 1 is called Hail, but the top display is just going to say CH1, CH2, etc. So just something to point out is make sure that those names line up, especially if you're making changes to the order of things in your zone channel assignment. Like I say, that's gotten me a couple times where the top display is saying something that I don't want it to say. So just a reminder to check both of those fields when you're naming your talk groups and your channels. We have gotten some questions on decommissioning radios, especially now as we talk through our TDMA transition and some of the things that are coming up with our upgrade. There is a procedure for this. You can look up on our website, procedure 200-4, but essentially what that procedure requires you to do is overwrite anything that's in that radio with a blank code plug. So if you put a blank code plug in there that doesn't have zones, channels, and especially the trunking system defined, that will overwrite the radio and take that proprietary information for your agency and for the system out. And as a reminder, before you send a radio out for service or transfer it to another agency or dispose of it, you must clear that code plug. All those configurations, and especially all those encryption keys, must be cleared. Keep in mind your agency may have additional procedures that you need to follow. Some agencies do not permit their radios to be loaned or transferred or anything like that. They must be disposed of in a proper way, or you may have more stringent clearing protocols. But just the takeaway to this is make sure that when you have old radios, if they're going end of life, if they're getting surplused, whatever they are, that all of the information, especially all of the encryption keys, if you use them, are cleared from those radios. One best practice tip that helps somewhat when you're trying to troubleshoot a radio is programming your radio to show the site and the signal that your radio is getting at that particular time. And that's especially something helpful if you're contacting the help desk, which I'll talk about in just a few moments. When you go into your radio, so radio ergonomics configuration is where you start. Then under the controls, there's a buttons option, and this is kind of what we looked at here just a few minutes ago when we were talking about the E button. But I want to point out the bottom row there. The bottom trunking button is set up. It's site display / search. If you set a button for that, then that button will, when it's pressed, momentarily show which site your radio is affiliated with, and also the received signal strength, which is a numeric number. Again, when you're reporting issues or trying to figure out if you're in a spot that isn't working or you're not getting to the site for whatever reason, you have to report that to us. It's very, very helpful to know which site and what the signal is you were getting and where you were. So I highly recommend that if you have a button available in your radios that you program that and let folks know and train your users that they can look that information up and capture it in that way. Another good best practice to check is your indicators. So in the APX software, if you go to the display and then go to the alarm section, there's a couple different alarms that you have options on how you want them to display. There's your out of range indicator, your imbalanced coverage indicator, site trunking indicator, and system registration indicator. The system registration indicator, we certainly recommend no indication on that. That's not really necessary, but the other three might consider putting alert and display in all of those. Out of range indicators is fairly obvious. If you go out of range of the system or out of the site, you don't have coverage, that'll show up for you, usually in a red bar or something attention grabbing. An imbalanced coverage indicator is also helpful. Imbalanced coverage is basically when you're not able to get to the site. Maybe you can receive from the site, but you can't actually transmit and get to that. So even though it looks like you're subscribed and you're receiving information, you may not be able to get it for whatever reason, get that transmit out. So that alert and display will alert your users to that. And then finally, site trunking. This is something that we kind of see inconsistently about whether that's an alert and display or whether people have any alert for that at all. And as a reminder, when we talk about site trunking is what occurs when you're affiliated to a particular site and that site for some reason loses communication with the wider ALMR network. So when you go into site trunking, you are able to talk to the radios that are also affiliated to that site. So essentially the radios in that local area, but you aren't able to talk any wider than that. And also your dispatch center is likely not able to hear you. So that's an important indicator that we recommend that people have set. So site trunking indicator, imbalanced coverage, and out of range are all good things to think about for your radios and for your users. Along the same vein, this is something that just makes things easier, obviously for your users in reporting things, but this is defining site aliases. And this is something, if you go in to your trunking configuration, trunking system, there's a section there for site alias, and you'll see an example here of some of the sites where we've assigned the site names to the site numbers. And what that does is previously when you hit that RSSI button, that site display button, by default, it's just going to say something like site 15, signal, whatever it is. By assigning an alias, by essentially putting the name on those sites, that allows it to say Blueberry Hill instead of site 15. It makes it a little bit easier to deal with by providing you a name instead of just a site number that you're trying to look up. It's a little bit arduous to do the first time you do it, but obviously this can be copied and pasted and cloned through your radios. So just something we recommend doing. It just makes it easier. It's certainly not a must-have, but a good best practice is to assign those site aliases. I've been talking about kind of some of the policies and procedures, and on this slide you'll see the four that I mentioned kind of during this briefing. If you go on to the ALMR website, where you can see there under ALMR, go under Documents, and you can see the Policies and Procedures section. Some of those policies and procedures have to do with system management, but there are, especially in that section 300, the operations, which talk about usage protocols, radio protocols, and some of those things. And certainly if you are programming radios on the system, we highly recommend that you're familiar with those. And if you have any questions on those, please reach out to us. Before I open up for questions and discussion with the staff here, I want to talk about a couple upcoming issues just to give people a heads up of these things that are coming down the pike as we record this here in early March. Annually, we require all of our members for our legislative audit to certify that their radio inventory with ALMR is correct. The radio inventories were sent out by the help desk near the end of last year. And recently here in the last 3 or 4 weeks, the confirmation forms have been sent out. And those are simply the form that you sign off and certify that inventory and get that back to Sherry. As of this morning, we are below half of our members getting those back to us. Those are due by the end of April, but certainly we appreciate putting that in your priority stack of things to deal with and get that signed off and returned to us so we can complete our audit. And again, if you have any questions on that, Sherry or I can certainly help you. We've been talking for the last year about the system upgrade that's currently in progress for ALMR and our transition to TDMA. And for those that aren't familiar, TDMA is a type of radio technology. It's an acronym. It stands for Time Division Multi-Access. And essentially, moving the system to TDMA is going to give us some significant advantages, specifically as it has to do with capacity. So TDMA is a much more efficient use of the radio spectrum, the actual radio frequencies that ALMR uses. And so that will allow essentially just simply more people. It'll double the capacity at each site when we fully transition to TDMA without us having to add additional channels and additional hardware. If you are running radios that are not TDMA compatible, they will need to be replaced at some point. And we will be seeing shortly here, most likely, the policy from the user council on putting a timeline forth and in doing that transition. It is still a ways off, but we are really trying to warn people and get people to plan for their various budget cycles and appropriations and things that those radios need to be replaced. In the Motorola side of the house, pretty much the APX series is the ones that are TDMA compatible. The older ones are not, and there's definitely variations from some of the other manufacturers like BK or EF Johnson. So on our website is the approved equipment list that you'll see, and there's a note next to any one of those radios on the system that are actually TDMA compatible. You'll see that when you go onto the website. We are working with some of our vendors. We know some of them do have some new radios coming down the pike here in the next 6 months or so. Those all have to go through an acceptance test with the ALMR staff before they're allowed on the system. So we know some of those are coming, and we'll be working to get those turned around quickly because we know some people will have quite a significant radio investment that they need to do. If you had compatible radios on the system that were TDMA before this policy was set out that we don't add non-TDMA radios, which was at the beginning of the last year, there will be an upgrade for your radio, a flash upgrade to enable that feature. That was part of this upgrade. So some people may have to do flash upgrades to their radios, and you'll be hearing about that individually, depending if that has to do with your agency. So probably expect to hear about that within the next 3 to 5 months, I believe. I know that is in progress. The TDMA transition will also require a revised band plan, and I mention this because that will require each of your radios to be touched and updated. Again, we will be working on the timeline for that, but as radio programmers, I wanted to give everybody a heads up that most likely we're going to start talking about that near the end of this year into next year, about getting those revised plans put in your radios. So please stay tuned for updates on that, and we are going to endeavor to give as much notice and make this transition just as easy as we possibly can. The other thing I wanted to mention here at this stage of the game is our preventative maintenance. And I know our system management staff are starting their preventative maintenance on the sites for this year, as well as some of the upgrades that are continuing. So please keep an eye on the daily status report that comes out from the help desk, and watch for any preventative maintenance downtime in your area. And those preventative maintenance with the new equipment that we upgraded to last year is got a fairly minimal downtime, but it is certainly something to be aware of. At the same time, I want to remind everybody that your subscriber units also require preventative maintenance, typically once a year, to make sure they are still operating effectively. So if you have not got those done or need to schedule those, please get with your vendor and do so. Finally, I want to mention when we talk about code plugs that there's absolutely just many options in these code plugs, and I've tried to hit just a few of the top ones. But the help desk is happy to review code plugs before you program them in your radios. And we're not able to create code plugs or program your entire fleet and do those types of things. But if you've made some changes and you'd like just a second set of eyes to double check, look for any issues, please feel free to email that to the help desk. And as soon as possible, they'll turn that around and get that to you. But that service is open to any of our members if they'd like to take advantage of that. Finally, if you do have issues with radios, there's some really helpful items that are very good if you're getting that information to the help desk. You can see on the screen when the issue happened, what the radio was that we're dealing with. Obviously, a description of what happened, where the radio was, if you have the site and the signal that was affiliated with, and what talk group it was on. That's very, very helpful because they can go in and they can actually look through raw data and some of the logs and help identify what a particular radio was doing and what the system was doing at that time that may have caused that issue. I really highly encourage folks, as you are dealing with your users and dealing with your agencies, if you're seeing issues or hearing comments about different problems that people are having with their radios or with ALMR in general, or specifically with any specific issues, please reach out to the help desk. Send an email is usually the easiest way. I can't tell you the amount of issues that we hear about second or third hand that people have been dealing with maybe for months or longer, where it's something that simply the staff hasn't had an opportunity to look into. And if we don't have those things reported to us, we can't fix them for you. So even if it seems silly, even if it was maybe a one-off, it might be worth just sending an email to the help desk and at least getting that on their radar. And certainly if it's something that you're seeing consistently, please let us know. We know that there are certainly areas of coverage issues and some of those that are well-known issues, but some of these other things might just simply be something that we need to tweak, or something that happened during the upgrade that we need to make some adjustments on the system level. And we had some great examples of that last fall where some of the power requirements changed because we got better antennas on some of the sites, and so the coverage was almost getting a little bit off from what people expected because we were actually putting much more power out than we used to with the old ways. So it's important to get that feedback, and I certainly highly suggest that people do that, and feel free to send an email again, even if it is just a one-off or something that doesn't seem like a big deal, to please do so. I feel like I talked fairly fast this morning. I'm kind of done with kind of the stuff that I prepared, but I wanted to take some time now and allow for any kind of free discussion. As I say, we've got some of our staff on the line if you have questions or technical questions that you'd like to ask. So I'll open it up. Feel free to raise your hand or shout out, and we'll be happy to talk radio programming and anything else with you before we wrap up today. And while we're waiting for that, if people have questions, you can feel free to raise your hand. I am going to ask, there's a link that I'm putting in the chat. We do have a brief evaluation that I'd like to ask everybody to fill out. Should take just a few moments, but if you click that link in the chat, it'll take you to about a 5 or 6 question form. Please let us know if this content was useful to you, and also what content for training you'd like to see in the future. We are working to have a good, robust training program as best we can, so your feedback is essential to that. Let me take a look here at, I don't see any hands raised, so I'll just wait here. Is there any comments or questions or anything from anybody in the group today? I don't see any hands raised, so we're going to go ahead and close the recording out, and we will get this put on the website. Our staff will also be in the room here for a few more minutes if you think of anything else. So I'll ask Sherry to stop the recording and thank everybody very much for their time. Like I say, we'll be around here for a few minutes. Please don't hesitate to fill out the training evaluation and share with us your thoughts. And thank you very much, everybody.